The air in the gilded quill was a carefully curated symphony of hushed conversations, the gentle clink of silver on porcelain, and the distant romantic sigh of a lone cello. It was a place preserved in amber, a relic of old New York elegance, where time didn't so much pass as it deepened. Every detail, from the dark mahogany paneling to the intricate hand-painted frescoes on the vaulted ceiling, spoke of a legacy meticulously maintained. At a small, secluded table near the grand Palladian window, Serafina Washington sat alone, a quiet island in the sea of quiet opulence. At 24, she possessed a stillness that seemed at odds with her youth. Dressed in a simple grey turtleneck and dark slacks, with her hair pulled back in a simple bun, she could have been a graduate student seeking refuge from the city's clamour. In her hands was not a phone, but a leather-bound sketchbook, its pages filled with elegant, precise architectural drawings. A soft smile touched her lips as she added the final shading to a rendering of a Corinthian capital. This dinner was a private celebration. Earlier that day, her proposal to restore the historic facade of the old city library, a project everyone said was impossible, had been accepted. She had won not with flash or connections, but with obsessive research and a profound understanding of classical design that bordered on the clairvoyant. The symphony of the room was abruptly shattered by a discordant note. A voice, sharp and brittle as frozen glass, sliced through the calm. "Absolutely not. I will not be seated there. Do you have any idea who I am?" Heads turned. The serene atmosphere rippled with discomfort. In the entryway stood Beatrice Sterling, 26, daughter of the real estate titan Bartholomew Sterling, a man who devoured city blocks and spit out glass and steel monoliths. Beatrice was his heir apparent in both fortune and temperament. She was dressed in a crimson dress so loud it seemed to shout, her blonde hair a sculpted helmet, her face a mask of bored, aggressive entitlement. The maître d', a man named Philip, whose composure was usually as unshakable as the building's foundation, visibly flinched. "My apologies, Miss Sterling. We are fully booked this evening. This was the only table available on such short notice." Beatrice's gaze swept the room with the predatory air of a hawk searching for prey. It skimmed over couples, families, and businessmen before landing, with surgical precision, on Serafina's small table by the window, her lip curled into a sneer. "That one," she declared, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. "That's my table. I always sit by the window." Philip's face paled. "Miss Sterling, that table is occupied. The young lady has already been served." "The young lady?" Beatrice's laugh was a dry, rattling sound. She strode toward Serafina's table, her heels clicking like tiny, angry hammers on the marble floor. The entire restaurant fell silent, a captive audience to a drama no one had paid for. Beatrice stopped directly in front of Serafina, looking down at her as if she were an interesting but unpleasant insect. She didn't address Serafina directly, instead speaking to Philip as if Serafina wasn't there. "Remove her. Now." "People like that," she said, waving a dismissive hand at Serafina's simple attire and worn sketchbook, "should be eating in the kitchen with the staff, not taking up prime real estate." The phrase "people like that" hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a weapon coated in classism, sharpened with racism, and aimed with practiced cruelty. Serafina slowly looked up from her sketchbook, her calm brown eyes meeting Beatrice's icy blue ones. "I believe you're mistaken," she said, her voice soft but clear. This table was reserved. Beatrice finally deigned to look at her. "Oh, it speaks," she sneered. "Listen, sweetheart. My father could buy this entire block including this dusty old restaurant and you along with it. The only mistake here is you thinking you belong. Did you wander in off the street? Did you save up for a month just to take a picture for your little blog?" A few diners shifted uncomfortably. A man at a nearby table muttered, "This is appalling." Beatrice overheard him. "Oh, spare me the faux outrage," she snapped, her voice rising. "If she belonged here, she wouldn't look like she just got off a Greyhound bus. This is the Gilded Quill, not a soup kitchen." Philip rushed forward, his hands fluttering nervously. "Miss Sterling, please, let's not cause a scene." "I'm not causing a scene. I'm correcting an error," Beatrice retorted, her gaze fixed on Serafina. "Some people need to be reminded of their place. Now, are you going to get up, or do I need to have my father call the owner and have both of you thrown out?" The threat was not idle. The Sterling name carried immense weight in the city, a battering ram of influence and intimidation. Philip's professional spine seemed to dissolve. He turned to Serafina, his expression a miserable mix of apology and pleading. "Mum," he began, his voice barely a whisper. Perhaps we could find you another table. A very nice one, in the back." The humiliation was a physical blow. To be displaced, to be publicly shamed, to be deemed unworthy. Serafina felt a familiar, hot sting behind her eyes, the echo of 1,000 slights she and people who looked like her had endured for generations. She took a slow, deep breath, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind from a long-ago childhood. "Dignity isn't what they give you, baby girl. It's what they can't take away." Slowly, deliberately, Serafina closed her sketchbook. She placed her napkin on the table and rose to her feet. She didn't look defeated. She looked regal. Beatrice smirked, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Now you can go back to wherever it is you came from." She slid into the newly vacated chair, not even bothering to wait for the staff to clear Serafina's half-eaten meal. She pulled out her phone and began typing, a self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. As Philip led Serafina away, a wave of whispers followed her. "Did you see that? Just let her take the table. It's Beatrice Sterling. What do you expect?" Each whisper was another small cut. They seated her at a cramped table near the service entrance, a place of constant traffic and clattering trays. It was an exile, a deliberate demotion. From her new vantage point, she could see Beatrice holding court at the window table, laughing loudly, gesturing for champagne, soaking in the attention her cruelty had generated. But Serafina Washington wasn't watching Beatrice. Her gaze had drifted past the socialite, past the window, to the wall itself. Her brow furrowed slightly. Something was wrong. Not socially wrong, but structurally. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration hummed through the floorboards, a tremor too rhythmic to be the subway. And on the ornate plasterwork near the ceiling, directly above where Beatrice now sat, a hairline crack, thin as a spider's thread, was tracing a path she knew it shouldn't be. She had noticed it subtly when she first sat down, an architect's habit of reading a room's bones. But now, sitting here in the forced stillness of her humiliation, with her senses sharpened by adrenaline, she felt it more acutely. She listened past the noise of the restaurant, tuning her ear to the building itself, and she heard it. A low, grinding groan from the earth, the sound of immense pressure being exerted somewhere nearby. She knew exactly what it was. The new Sterling Tower construction site was right next door. Bartholomew Sterling had famously cut corners, using non-union labor and fast-tracking foundation work to save millions. The city's preservation committee, a committee she secretly advised, had warned him that his deep excavation could destabilize the foundations of the adjacent historical buildings. He had laughed them off. Serafina opened her sketchbook again, but not to draw. She flipped to a blank page and began to write, her pen flying. Calculations, stress vectors, load-bearing analysis based on the building's original 1890 blueprints, which she had committed to memory years ago. Beatrice Sterling thought she had won a battle over a table. She had no idea she was sitting directly under the weakest point of a ceiling that was slowly, silently, beginning to fail. And Serafina, the woman she had just dismissed as insignificant, was the only person in the entire building who knew it. The humiliation of the past 10 minutes began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was no longer about a stolen seat. It was about saving a building she loved and every life within it. In a quiet office on the second floor, Julian Croft, the 68-year-old owner of the Gilded Quill, was reviewing the week's receipts when a faint but distinct tremor rattled a crystal decanter on his desk. He frowned. It was the third one he'd felt that evening. He was a man who knew his building intimately. He'd inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his. The Gilded Quill wasn't just a business to him. It was a living, breathing member of his family. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the window overlooking the alley that separated his property from the gaping maw of the Sterling construction site. The relentless, rhythmic thud of pile drivers vibrated through the soles of his expensive leather shoes. Bartholomew Sterling was a cancer on the city, a man who saw history as a tear-down opportunity. Julian had fought Sterling's zoning variances, filed complaints, and warned the city council, but Sterling's money shouted louder than his concerns. A knock came at his door. It was Philip, the maitre d', his face etched with anxiety. "Mr. Croft, sir, there was an incident." Julian turned, his thick silver eyebrows raised. "An incident? Philip, you've handled presidents and prima donnas. What could possibly rattle you?" "It's Miss Sterling, sir. Beatrice Sterling." Julian's expression hardened. What did she do now? She demanded a specific table, one that was already occupied by a young woman. She was quite forceful. I'm afraid I had to move the other guest. Philip looked down at his shoes, ashamed. Miss Sterling threatened to involve her father. Julian sighed, a deep, weary sound. He disliked the Sterlings with a passion, but they were a powerful, vindictive family. A public feud was bad for business. "And the other guest? Did she make a fuss?" "No, sir. That's the strange thing. She was remarkably composed, almost serene. She just gathered her things and allowed me to reseat her. Where is she now?" "Table 42, by the service corridor." A flicker of irritation crossed Julian's face. Table 42 was the worst in the house. It was where you put people you wanted to forget. "Philip, we don't treat guests that way. Not in my establishment." "I know, sir. I am deeply sorry. Miss Sterling was creating such a disturbance." "Fine," Julian said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'll go down and apologize to the young woman myself. Perhaps a bottle of the 82 Chateau Margaux will smooth things over." He prided himself on his personal touch, on righting the small injustices that occurred under his roof. He made his way downstairs, his eyes scanning the dining room. He saw Beatrice at the window table, preening like a spoiled cat, her laughter echoing unnaturally in the now subdued room. Then his eyes found table 42. He saw the young black woman, Serafina, sitting alone, her back straight, her focus absolute. But she wasn't looking forlorn or angry. She was bent over a sketchbook, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She wasn't sketching the room's decor. She was writing, her hand moving with a frantic, focused energy, occasionally pausing to press her fingertips to the table, as if taking the building's pulse. Julian paused, his curiosity piqued. This was not the behavior of a spurned diner nursing a grievance. This was something else, entirely. He approached her table slowly, preparing his polished apology. "Excuse me, miss," he began, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Serafina looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide and luminous, but they held a spark of fierce intelligence that took him aback. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you. My name is Julian Croft. I own the Gilded Quill," he said, extending a hand. "I wanted to personally and sincerely apologize for the behavior of my staff and of my other guest. What happened was unacceptable." Serafina shook his hand, her grip firm and cool. "Thank you, Mr. Croft. That's kind of you." She made no complaint, offered no story of her mistreatment. Her focus was elsewhere. "I'd like to offer you a bottle of our finest wine, on the house, as a small token of my regret," he offered. "That's very generous," she said, her eyes already drifting away from him, upwards towards the ceiling. "But I'm afraid there's a more pressing issue." Julian frowned. "Oh?" He assumed she was about to leverage the situation, perhaps demand a better table now that the owner was involved. "The vibrations," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "From the construction site next door, they're not just an annoyance. They're hitting a resonant frequency with the primary floor joists of this section." Julian stared at her, dumbfounded. He had felt the tremors, but he had no idea what she was talking about. "Resonant frequency? I'm sorry, I don't." She pointed with her pen toward the ceiling above Beatrice's table. "That fresco, the one of the Muse Calliope, it's painted on horsehair plaster, applied over wooden lath. A magnificent example of late Victorian craftsmanship. But it's brittle. Look closely, just to the left of her lyre. Do you see it?" Julian squinted. He saw nothing. "See what?" "A stress fracture. It wasn't there an hour ago. I checked." She spoke with the casual authority of a surgeon discussing an X-ray. "The foundation pilings they're driving next door are creating harmonic tremors. Your building is old. It was built to settle, to breathe. It wasn't built to withstand a constant, high-frequency assault. The integrity of that entire ceiling section is compromised." Julian felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had a deep, instinctual knowledge of his building, but this was technical, specific. He looked from her earnest, intelligent face to the oblivious diners. Was she a crank? An opportunist trying to create a different kind of scene? But there was a conviction in her voice, a frightening certainty in her eyes that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "How could you possibly know all that?" he asked, his voice laced with a skepticism he didn't entirely feel. Serafina finally met his gaze directly. The full force of her intellect was focused on him now. "Because my doctoral thesis was on the structural vulnerabilities of 19th century brownstone foundations in response to modern excavation techniques," she said calmly. "And I spent 6 months studying the original blueprints of this very building for the city's historical archives. I know where every beam, every joist, and every nail is, and I'm telling you, that ceiling is in imminent danger of collapse." Before Julian could process the terrifying weight of her words, a sudden, violent shudder rocked the entire building. It was stronger than before, a deep, guttural lurch from the earth. A collective gasp swept the room. Glasses rattled, and a bottle of wine toppled over at a nearby table, staining the white linen cloth a deep, bloody red. At the window table, Beatrice Sterling let out a theatrical shriek. What was that? An earthquake? In her exaggerated panic, she shoved her chair back violently. The heavy oak chair scraped across the floor, and its back slammed hard against the mahogany-panelled wall. The impact was the final straw. A loud crack, like a rifle shot, echoed through the dining room. Every head snapped upwards. The hairline fracture Serafina had pointed out exploded into a web of deep, dark fissures. A shower of fine white dust rained down, powdering Beatrice's crimson dress and perfectly coiffed hair. For a moment, there was a stunned, perfect silence. Then, Serafina's voice cut through it, not with panic, but with absolute command. "Everyone get out! Now! Move away from the windows!" The spell broke. Chaos erupted. Screams tore through the air as diners scrambled from their chairs, a panicked herd rushing for the exit. Philip and the waitstaff stood frozen for a second, their professional training utterly useless against this primal terror. Julian Croft, however, was galvanized. The look in Serafina's eyes, the chilling accuracy of her prediction, it all crashed over him with the force of undeniable truth. He trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming that this young woman had just saved them all. "She's right!" he roared, his powerful voice booming over the din. "Philip, get the staff and help clear the room. Emergency exit in the rear. Move, people, move!" While others fled, Serafina moved with a strange, focused calm. Her eyes were still on the ceiling, tracking the spread of the cracks, her mind performing a rapid, desperate calculation of how much time they had. She saw an elderly couple frozen in fear near the center of the room, the husband trying to help his wife, who had stumbled. Without a second thought, Serafina ran toward them, not away from the danger. "Sir, ma'am, come with me," she urged, taking the woman's arm and helping her to her feet. "Stay close to the interior walls." Meanwhile, Beatrice Sterling was having a complete meltdown. "My bag! My Birkin is under the table!" she shrieked, trying to push back against the tide of fleeing people. "It's worth more than this entire building." A waiter grabbed her arm. "Miss, we have to go." "Don't touch me," she screamed, shoving him away. "I'm not leaving without my bag." Another deep groan shuddered through the building, longer and more menacing this time. A large piece of plaster, the size of a dinner plate, detached from the ceiling and crashed onto the table Beatrice had fought so hard for, shattering plates and glasses in a violent explosion of porcelain and crystal. That was enough to break through her avarice-fueled hysteria. Her face went slack with terror. Forgetting her purse, she turned and bolted for the door, shoving people out of her way with a strength born of pure panic. Julian was at the main entrance, directing the flow of terrified patrons out into the cool night air. He saw Serafina emerge last, supporting the elderly woman, her own face pale but resolute. He rushed to help them. Once they were safely on the sidewalk, amidst the growing crowd of evacuated diners and bewildered passers-by, Julian turned to Serafina. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. You were right about everything." Before she could reply, a deafening roar erupted from within the gilded quill. The magnificent Palladian window bowed outwards and then exploded in a shower of glass. The entire front section of the ceiling, the section with the priceless fresco of Calliope, collapsed inwards with a cataclysmic crash of splintering wood, shattering plaster, and twisting metal. A thick cloud of choking, ancient dust billowed out into the street. The spot where Beatrice Sterling had been sitting, the table she had so viciously claimed, was now buried under tons of rubble. The crowd stared in horrified silence. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Serafina stood beside Julian, her sketchbook clutched to her chest, her breathing shallow. She wasn't looking at the destruction with triumph or fear, but with a profound, aching sadness. A piece of history she had loved and studied was gone. Julian looked from the wreckage of his family's legacy to the face of the young woman who had saved dozens of lives. He, the owner, had been oblivious. His staff, paralyzed. The city's inspectors, bought off or incompetent. Only she had seen the truth, written in the subtle language of stress and strain. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice filled with awe. Serafina finally looked at him, the dust settling on her simple turtleneck like a fine grey snow. "My name is Serafina Washington," she said quietly. "I'm an architectural preservationist." In that moment, Julian Croft understood. The Sterling family, in their arrogance and greed, had nearly destroyed his world, and this quiet, unassuming young woman, a woman they had deemed worthless and insignificant, had been the only one with the knowledge and the courage to stop them. The battle for a table was over. The war for the soul of the city had just begun. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. Fire trucks, police cruisers, and emergency response vehicles choked the street, their strobes painting the scene in frantic strokes of red and blue. The evacuated diners, now wrapped in shock blankets provided by paramedics, gave fractured, breathless accounts to police officers and reporters who had descended like vultures. Through it all, two figures remained at the center of the controlled chaos: Julian Croft and Serafina Washington. Julian, his face a grim mask of shock and fury, was dealing with the fire chief, while Serafina was giving a calm, precise, and highly technical statement to a senior building inspector whose face grew paler with every word she spoke. The lateral pressure from the adjacent sub-level excavation must have compromised the integrity of the original 1890s rubble trench foundation, she explained, pointing toward the gaping hole where the window used to be. The gilded quill rests on unreinforced masonry. It was never designed to withstand the kind of seismic level vibrations their deep-driven piles are creating. The ceiling collapse was a symptom, not the cause. The entire western load-bearing wall is likely compromised. The inspector, a man named Henderson who had spent 30 years looking at blueprints, stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, how do you have this level of detail?" "As I told Mr. Croft, I've studied this building's schematics extensively. They're part of the public record, if one knows where to look," she replied, a subtle edge to her voice. "I filed a preliminary impact concern with the Department of Buildings 6 weeks ago on behalf of the Landmark Preservation Council. I specifically warned about the risk to this structure and the adjoining brownstones." Henderson's jaw tightened. He remembered the report now. A dense, technical file from an unknown consultant buried under a mountain of paperwork. It had been flagged, then dismissed, after a senior official received a call from Bartholomew Sterling's legal team, who assured them their own engineers had deemed everything perfectly safe. "Your report," he stammered. "It was under review." "While it was under review, a dozen people nearly died," Serafina stated flatly, her gaze unwavering. There was no "I told you so" in her tone, only the cold, hard weight of fact. Across the street, Beatrice Sterling was being attended to by paramedics, though she appeared physically unharmed. Her drama, however, was in full swing. "I could have been killed," she wailed to anyone who would listen, dabbing at her dust-streaked face with a silk handkerchief. "That building is a death trap, a fire hazard. My father will sue them into oblivion." A young reporter with a smartphone camera pushed through the crowd. "Miss Sterling, is it true you forced another diner from your table just moments before the collapse?" Beatrice's eyes flashed with venom. "That's a ridiculous lie. I was a paying customer, and the management was incompetent. That other girl, whoever she was probably a plant, trying to extort me. This is all a setup to tarnish my family's name." But her narrative was already crumbling. Other diners, their initial shock giving way to anger, were beginning to talk. An elderly man, the same one Serafina had helped, spoke to another reporter. "That young woman didn't just save my wife and me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She saved everyone. She was calm, she was brave, and that sterling woman treated her like dirt." The story was shifting. The viral moment Beatrice had hoped to create by humiliating a nobody was morphing into something she couldn't control. She was no longer the powerful socialite. She was the villain in a story of greed and arrogance, while the quiet girl in the grey turtleneck was becoming the reluctant hero. Julian finished his conversation with the fire chief and walked over to Serafina. He looked exhausted, older than he had just an hour ago. "They've condemned the building," he said, his voice hollow. "At least for now. They won't let anyone back in until a full structural analysis is done." He looked at the ruined facade of his family's restaurant. It might be over. Sterling might have won after all. "He hasn't won anything," Serafina said, her voice firm. "He's been exposed. This isn't just a structural failure, Mr. Croft. It's evidence. Evidence of negligence, of The sirens faded, but their ghost wail lingered in Serafina's ears, a high, thin counterpoint to the thrumming in her own blood. The drive to her small downtown office was a smear of streetlights and fractured images, the spiderweb of cracks spreading across a priceless fresco, the bloom of ancient dust, the hollow-eyed shock on Julian Croft's face. She had not gone home. Sleep was an impossible country, its borders sealed by adrenaline and a terrible, crystalline clarity. Her office was a sanctuary of ordered thought, a stark contrast to the night's chaos. It was small, crammed with books on structural engineering and urban history, the walls covered not with art, but with meticulously rendered elevations of forgotten buildings. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of architecture she loved, the trembling finally started in her hands. She set her sketchbook down, the pages filled with the frantic calculus of disaster, and pressed her palms flat against the cool, solid wood of her drafting table, anchoring herself to something that would hold. It hadn't been triumph she'd felt on that sidewalk, watching the ruin of a place she cherished. It was a cold, sickening validation, a profound grief. She had been right, and the cost of her correctness was a gaping wound in the city's heart. The humiliation she'd suffered at Beatrice Sterling's hands felt like a lifetime ago, a trivial prologue to a far greater tragedy. The sting of racism, the venom of classism, they were sharp, familiar pains, but the sound of a century-old building groaning in its death throes was a pain that resonated in her very bones. The door creaked open, and Julian Croft stood there, looking like a king surveying a fallen kingdom. He held 2 paper cups of what smelled like brutally strong coffee. He hadn't called. He had simply known she would be here. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice raspy. He placed a cup beside her sketchbook. His eyes, red-rimmed and weary, scanned her office, taking in the detailed drawings, the stacks of reference materials. It was the gaze of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "Thank you, Julian," she said, the use of his first name feeling natural, forged in the crucible of the evening. He leaned against a bookshelf, the movement heavy with an exhaustion that was more than physical. "My lawyers are already at it. Marcus Thorne, he's a shark. He's talking injunctions, discovery, punitive damages, a war." He shook his head, a gesture of disbelief. "All these years I fought Sterling in boardrooms and at zoning meetings. I fought him with petitions and precedents. I never thought the battle would be won or lost in my own dining room." "This isn't the end of the battle," Serafina said, her voice quiet but firm. She tapped the sketchbook. "This is the beginning. What happened tonight wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of 1,000 corrupt decisions, 1,000 corners cut, 1,000 warnings ignored. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with an intensity that belied her exhaustion. They didn't just break your restaurant, Julian. They broke the law, they broke the public trust, and they left a trail. For the next 6 months, they followed that trail. The world saw a sensational legal drama unfold, a media narrative of the brilliant underdog architect versus the monstrous corporate titan. But for Serafina, it was not a drama. It was a painstaking, relentless excavation of facts. She spent her days in dusty city archives, her nights under the fluorescent hum of law offices, poring over geotechnical reports, falsified safety inspections, and shell corporations designed to shield Bartholomew Sterling from liability. The Sterling legal team came for her with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. They tried to discredit her credentials in depositions, their questions dripping with condescension. A slick, silver-haired lawyer named Davenport had tried to corner her. "Miss Washington," he'd said, leaning forward, a predatory smile on his lips. "You have quite a passion for these old buildings. One might even call it an obsession. Is it possible that your emotional attachment clouded your judgment on the night in question? That you saw what you wanted to see?" Serafina had met his gaze without blinking. She slid a document across the table, a geological survey map overlaid with her own precise calculations. "Emotion doesn't create harmonic resonance, Mr. Davenport. Physics does. My attachment is to empirical data. On page 3 of your own contracted engineering report, the one submitted by a firm your client has a controlling interest in, they note a soil density variance that they subsequently ignore in their load-bearing projections. It's not an emotional oversight, it's mathematical fraud. Would you like me to walk you through the equations? I have them here." She had pushed her sketchbook forward. Davenport had leaned back, his smile vanishing. They tried to paint her as an opportunist, leaking stories to tabloids that hinted she was seeking fame and fortune. They dug into her past, looking for dirt, and came up with nothing but academic awards and a small unpaid advisory role with the Landmark Preservation Council. Their attacks only made her a more sympathetic figure. She never gave a press conference, never appeared on a talk show. Her testimony, when it was finally given in a sealed hearing, was her only public statement. It was a masterclass in forensic architecture, a cold, elegant demolition of the Sterling Empire's foundation of lies. While Serafina dissected the crime, Julian rallied the city. He became the face of the fight, his quiet dignity and profound love for his heritage a powerful rebuke to Sterling's soulless greed. He gathered other property owners, small business owners, and historical societies who had been bullied and threatened by Sterling's expansion. The lawsuit grew into a class action, a collective roar of defiance from the soul of the city. The breaking point came not in a courtroom, but in the sterile silence of a federal prosecutor's office. Faced with irrefutable evidence of bribery, conspiracy, and criminal negligence that implicated not just him, but several key figures in the Department of Buildings, Bartholomew Sterling's empire folded. The settlement was seismic. It included a fund to repair the damage to all affected properties, a complete, permanent halt to the Sterling Tower project, and the largest fine ever levied against a developer in the city's history. And, separately, a private settlement to Julian Croft, the amount of which was sealed but rumoured to be astronomical. There was no public apology from Beatrice. Julian had initially demanded it, but Serafina had asked him to strike the clause. It would be meaningless, she'd told him. A forced performance. It's not about her. It was never about her. The real consequences for the Sterlings were far more profound than a staged apology. Their name, once a synonym for power, became a shorthand for disgrace. Bartholomew Sterling, facing indictment, suffered a massive stroke that left him incapacitated, a Titan-turned invalid in his own penthouse. The company was dismantled, its assets seized and sold off. Beatrice vanished from the social pages. The friends who had flocked to her table at the Gilded Quill no longer returned her calls. The crimson dress and the Birkin bag became artifacts of a life that no longer existed. She was left with a tarnished name and a fraction of a fortune, a ghost haunting the ruins of her father's ambition. 1 year after the collapse, Serafina stood in the cavernous, skeletal space of the Gilded Quill. The air smelled of sawdust, wet plaster, and the faint, lingering scent of old smoke and memory. For 12 months, this had been her true office, her true purpose. The settlement money could have rebuilt the restaurant 10 times over. But that was never the point. With Julian's blessing, she was leading the restoration herself, not just as a consultant, but as the chief architect. She ran her hand over a newly installed mahogany panel, its grain smooth and dark as rich soil. She wasn't just rebuilding, she was healing the space. She'd spent weeks with archival experts and master craftsmen, sourcing materials and techniques that honored the building's original 1890 design. But she was also reinforcing it, weaving a hidden skeleton of modern steel into the historic framework, strengthening the foundation with techniques she herself had pioneered. She was making it stronger, more resilient, capable of withstanding the shocks of a new century. Julian found her there, standing in a shaft of late-afternoon sun that streamed through the newly installed Palladian window. He no longer looked like a grieving king. He looked energized, purposeful. He was dressed not in a tailored suit, but in work boots and a flannel shirt, his silver hair dusted with plaster. "It breathes again," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. He looked around at the teams of artisans working on the plasterwork, the electricians wiring the new sconces. "You know, my grandfather laid the original marble floors himself. He used to say a building has a soul, and you have to listen to it." He looked at Serafina. "You listened." "It told me what it needed," she replied simply. She unrolled a blueprint on a makeshift table. "The fresco. We can begin next week. I found a family of artisans in Florence who still use the traditional buon fresco technique. They're flying in. Whatever it takes," Julian said. He gestured around the vast room. "This is more than a restaurant now. It's a testament." He paused, then looked at her, his expression serious. "The Croft Washington Preservation Trust. The papers are drawn up. We have our first project lined up, the old public library on the Lower East Side, the one whose facade you wanted to restore." Serafina felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sunlight. The library project had been her private celebration on the night of the collapse. It felt like closing a circle. "I'd be honored, Julian." "The honor is mine," he said. "You didn't just save the lives in this room, Serafina. You saved its life. You saved a piece of my family. You reminded the city what's worth fighting for." The grand reopening of the Gilded Quill was not the event of the season. It was a quiet affair, by invitation only. The guests were not celebrities and politicians, but the craftsmen who had rebuilt it, the preservationists who had supported the cause, the families of the other businesses on the block, and the diners who had been there that fateful night. The symphony of the room was back, but it was softer, more intimate. Serafina did not take the table by the window. That table, by silent, mutual agreement, remained empty. A single white rose in a slender silver vase, its only occupant. It was not a shrine to what was lost, but a quiet acknowledgement of what had been learned. Serafina spent the evening moving through the room, a ghost in a simple dark blue dress, speaking with the plasterers, shaking hands with the elderly couple she had helped to safety. She felt a profound sense of peace. She wasn't a guest here, or even a hero. She was a guardian. She knew the secrets of the building's bones, the strength of its heart. Late in the evening, Julian found her by the service entrance, the very spot where she had been exiled. He handed her a glass of wine. It was an '82 Chateau Margaux. "A promise is a promise," he said with a smile, "even if it's a year late." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the life of the reborn room. The light seemed warmer, the conversations more genuine. It was a place redeemed. "Do you ever think about her?" Julian asked quietly. Serafina knew who he meant. "Sometimes." She looked towards the empty window table. I hope she found something real to hold on to. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Serafina was walking through a less fashionable part of the city, surveying an old, neglected firehouse the Trust was considering for its next project. As she turned a corner, she saw her. Beatrice Sterling was coming out of a small, nondescript office building. She was dressed in a simple trench coat and jeans, her blonde hair no longer a sculpted helmet, but pulled back in a simple ponytail. She carried not a designer bag, but a canvas tote. She looked thinner, and the aggressive entitlement in her posture was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness. Their eyes met across the sidewalk. For a split second, the world stopped. Serafina saw a flicker of recognition in Beatrice's eyes, followed by a complex storm of shame, fear, and something that looked almost like resignation. Beatrice froze, as if expecting a confrontation, a final, public condemnation. Serafina simply held her gaze for a moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive. It wasn't about Beatrice anymore. It was a nod of acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of the wreckage, of the strange, brutal journey they had both been on. And then Serafina turned and continued down the street. She did not look back. Her work was ahead of her. The city was all around her, a living museum of stories written in brick and mortar, in stone and steel. And she, Serafina Washington, was no longer just a reader of those stories. She was one of their keepers, one of their defenders, a quiet architect of memory and resilience, ensuring that the soul of the city would not just endure, but prevail.